IISD reporting services in Bonn for the first UN climate change talks following the conclusion of the Paris Agreement. Today, May 18th, we covered a side event about REDD+, meaning that beyond addressing climate mitigation through the fight against deforestation and degradation, governments and other stakeholders must include the role of conservation, sustainable management of forests, and enhancement of forest carbon stocks. In Bonn, a group of experts had then the opportunity to explain some of the current challenges around REDD+, and also share some of the success stories.
Well, today we had an event on performance assessment in REDD+, the reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And this is linked to the fact that REDD+ is actually a performance-based payment mechanism, which means that countries will be paid for reduced emissions. In this event, we looked back at our research from 7 years of research in what we call the Global Comparative Study on REDD+, which is an effort trying to understand policy mechanisms, the practice of REDD+, the measurement and verification of REDD+, and how to embed REDD+ in the bigger context of landscape, of multifunctional landscapes. And we do it in a comparative way. We look at several countries, 15 countries for the policy research, and 6 countries and 23 project sites for the actual assessment of REDD+ projects in practice.
Deforestation and forest degradation account for nearly 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions, more than the entire global transportation sector, and second only to the energy sector. If we take into consideration the goal to constrain climate change impacts through the now conservative target of 2 degrees Celsius, this will be practically impossible to achieve without reducing emissions from the forest sector. However, assessing the implementation of REDD+ on the ground remains a technical challenge.
What I focus on is mainly on how to measure actually performance. So if you are looking into forest change, how do you know if change over time can actually be attributed to the REDD intervention? How do you know that it's not caused by something else in the area? So that is quite difficult to do, but we found a way to do that to include control areas. So by looking not only on before and after, but also to compare these trends in the intervention area and the control sites, then you can see changes and you can actually attribute the change to the REDD+ impact itself. So I think it's very important to put your results that you have into context and to understand the causes of deforestation, because then you can really see if it can be attributed to REDD+ or if there's something else happening.
REDD is not a free lunch, meaning that we can see that a lot of the benefit sharing terminology and discourse has developed around things such as petroleum or mining incomes, things that are very profitable, where you take out resources from the ground and people want some decent share of that money. That is not necessarily going to be the case in terms of REDD, because we can see that in most circumstances, reducing deforestation will carry some costs for land stewards on the ground.
If REDD+ is not a free lunch, what are the main difficulties when implementing this type of projects?
It's interesting because everyone's aware that governance matters. I mean, pretty much anywhere you go these days, people talk about governance in forests, including around REDD. But when you actually get down to the specifics around how projects are organized or how REDD is being promoted internationally or even in the national level, you find sort of this idea that somehow the politics can be removed from the equation and that the technical aspects can solve the problem and make it move forward. So one of the things we found is that wherever we went, we would hear people come up with ideas like, well, if we could just solve the coordination issues. We just need to get these sectors to coordinate with each other. Or we just need to make land use planning binding. Or we just need to get the coordination between the different levels of government that do land use planning. But without ever taking the step back and saying, why doesn't that work now? And it doesn't work now because of the politics and the interests and the multiple interests behind the way things are now.
Since the Stern report, REDD has been flagged as one of the sort of easy ways to achieve climate change mitigation. I think perhaps some of the simplifying assumptions behind the Stern report and other studies of a similar kind, perhaps they have exaggerated those possibilities a little bit. But it's certainly something that the global community can do something about fairly quickly. If there's political will, you can reach a long way in terms of reducing deforestation by enforcing the law in a more effective way. That does not necessarily have to be very costly. And Brazil has developed both the monitoring technology and the sort of environmental police that can make it happen on the ground.
The other thing we found, and this was very clear across the research, is the importance of leaders, or the importance of people who think differently. And that was true in terms of the implementation of rules. For example, in Indonesia, one of the highlights was an oil palm company that not only follows the rules that they're supposed to in terms of engagement with communities, but actually went a lot further in terms of making sure that the community was really on board with what they wanted to do in their communities, involving them in decision making, and the community members really talked about it as their own project, which was, pretty interesting. Legitimacy is a very important aspect in terms of engaging with communities, for example. So where communities feel that support projects and where there's less conflict, those are places where the project or the government or whoever's managing the REDD in that area has gone out of their way to actually make sure people are fully informed, make them feel part of the process, include them in decision making about benefit sharing, include them in the decisions about how to manage their forest or how to change their land use practices. So legitimacy is a really important issue.
So the study we had 7 years almost of research, 2 phases. Now we're looking at the 3rd phase, which is going for the next 5 years. So and we think it's very exciting because we are happy to be able to continue this work. And we do it because we think that countries need analysis and knowledge and tools that comes from this comparative research to understand better what works and what doesn't. And some things may work in one country and not in the other, and so they can learn from each other. And so we think it's very important that we bring this out. It's not just an academic exercise, but we bring it out to countries and also to the international debate, like here in the UNFCCC COP, but also to the Green Climate Fund and other users of this knowledge.